Greetings to every one of you out there, and welcome especially to Engineer Construction Lecture Hub. Today we are going to discuss about a very important topic as regards to building construction. All right, today we are going to talk about factors that determines DPC level. Factors that determines DPC level. All right. Now, when we talk about DPC level, we are referring to the improved cost. Okay, that is what we refer to as DPC. Okay, that is what we refer to as DPC. All right, it is that part of the building that that demarcates or separates the substructure and the superstructure. Okay, it is very critical that part of the building should be taken seriously in terms of construction, in terms of material to be used at that level, because most times our buildings faces a lot of challenges that emanates from that section of the building. All right, so we want to look at the factors that will determine the level of your DPC or the height of your DPC. Okay, now first and foremost, the first one is flood level. Now, as you know, flooding is a kind of a routine, more of a perennial occurrences, okay, that we normally experience. And this flooding is associated with water overflowing its bank and spread to areas. All right, now you see that most buildings that are located in those flood prone areas, okay, if they don't have good DPC level, you see that building will be flooded. All right, it will be flooded. All right, so we try as much as possible to raise our DPC level high, such a way that it will help to reduce the effect of that flooding. Because you see that most times when this flooding comes, you see water gushing out of the floor. All right, you see water coming in through the door openings and some other outlets, okay, within some other openings within the building. Now this is because the water level has exceeded that the height of that DPC. Okay, that is why the water finds its way to the building. All right, so for us to be able to mitigate or a kind of overcome this flooding, we try as much as possible to raise the DPC level of our building, above the water level. So usually we do studies. All right, we take studies of previous flood levels within that location. All right, so we try to now get a sufficient or a good height that will, even at worst condition, that building will not have that flooding issue. All right, once we have a good height of our DPC level. All right, so DPC level is one of the factors that will determine the level of our DPC. Okay, then another thing that we are going to look at is also the existing road level. Okay, the existing road level or height. or height. Okay, now you see that areas, we have access roads, that passes almost across, along properties. All right, it's important before you start developing that property, you take an understudy, you look at the road, the level of the road. All right, then you now take height of your DPC to be above the height of the existing road, because the reason is, once there is water, like we talked about in flooding, you see, most times you see that water tends to take flow based on the height, of that area. Okay, water stagnates based on the topography of that area. All right, so we try to take our DPC above the road level. All right, so that you have some steps before you can access the building. All right, so that is also one of the factors that will determine the DPC level. The height of existing road, okay, is also what we consider, that influences the height of our DPC. Then another thing that we're going to look at is aesthetics. Okay, the aesthetic aspect. Now, you know that most times when we have our buildings high, okay, it brings that beauty, it gives some beauty to that structure. All right, there are some buildings you have to, climb some number of steps before you get to the main porch. All right, now this is also because that porch, getting to that porch, is usually seen as where the planes beam runs. All right, and that is the DPC level. All right, so getting that number of steps before you get to the porch has already shown the height of DPC. All right, so that also gives some level of aesthetics, to our building. All right, so sometimes we raise our DPC level because of the aesthetic aspect of it. All right, now we are going to also look at the aspect of topography. Okay, topography. Now you see that we have different topographic makeups in various areas. All right, so you see that there are some areas that are very, very below, very, very low. So we try as much as possible to raise our DPC level, so we can't subject that building or that structure to, to all of these water issues, water related issues, like your capillarity, that is your capillary action. All right, when you raise your DPC level to be high enough, you see that the extent of capillarity will be curtailed. All right, because capillarity has to do with the movement of water, in a medium. Okay, in this case, maybe a block, a concrete. All right, water tends to move, upwards. So when you have your DPC high enough, you see that the water will have limitation, in traveling that height before getting into the interior of that building. So topography also influences the level of our DPC height. All right, so these are some of the factors that we are expected to look at when we are considering the level of our DPC. Okay, so I'm going to stop here for today. Thank you so much. Please do well to stick to Benjina Construction Lecture Hall and for more useful updates. Thank you very much, and do have a lovely day. Thank you.